Hello, welcome back. I would like to kind of continue along the path of really looking at what BCA holistic approach means regarding emotions. Because I had mentioned earlier that emotions just give us power without telling us what to do. They don't provide insight or guidance or direction. I briefly talked about how our brain works, and specifically that when you look at the brain, the thinking part, the cortex, isn't fully developed till we're about 25. But the amygdala, the emotional center, is fully developed at birth. That we can only have one thought at any given moment in time, but we can have a bunch of feelings and have mixed feelings. I would also say that the emotional center doesn't change when we have emotions. It just gives us power, emotional power, electrical impulses, chemical urges, hormonal urges. But our cortex changes every time we have a new thought. It essentially rewires itself to be able to think in a new way. So, very different functions. One of the things that I would like to mention is when I think of how our body works. We have essentially what I would think of as 4 basic life functions that we can manage, but we cannot stop. And specifically, what I mean by that is like our breathing. We can hold our breath, we can breathe deep, we can breathe shallow, we can breathe many different ways. We can manage our breath, but we cannot stop breathing. We will die if we do that. Likewise, when we pee, we can manage when and where and how we pee, but we cannot stop peeing. And when we fight against it and try to hold it in, we lose control eventually and pee somewhere. It's going to happen. We cannot stop peeing. Third one is sleeping. We can stay awake as long as we want. We can fight against it, but eventually you will fall asleep. And people sometimes fight against it and fall asleep when they really, really don't want to, like when people fall asleep driving, or they fall asleep in a meeting. So sleeping is another thing that we can fight against, but we manage how it impacts our lives, and it is unstoppable. When I think of the 4th basic life function that we can manage, but we cannot stop, it's the one that we oftentimes don't think about. And yet, it is the very first one that impacts our lives as we are born. When we are born, we take our first breath. Shortly after that, we have our first pee. Shortly after that, the baby will fall asleep. But the very first basic life function is that the baby will feel. They'll have an emotion about being born. They will feel an emotion, a change, whether it's fear or happiness or anxiety, but they have an emotional response. And so our very first emotional experience, our very first basic life function is really having emotions. And when we fight against our emotions, it makes things worse. And this has been known for a long time. Sigmund Freud said, unexpressed emotions never die. They are just buried alive and come forth later in uglier ways. And Carl Jung added, what we resist persists. And so when I think of people who say, I don't want to be depressed, and they fight against it and stuff it in and stuff it in, to me that's not any different than someone says, I don't want to breathe, and they hold their breath. Or they say, I'm not going to pee, and they hold their pee just as long as they can. And the harder they fight against it, the worse things get, the less control they have. When they say, I gotta pee, how am I gonna manage this? I gotta breathe, how am I gonna manage this? I have to sleep, how am I gonna manage this? Is the same as saying, I'm depressed, and that's okay. How am I going to manage this? Or, I'm angry, and that's okay. How am I going to manage this? You try to hold it in and fight against it, especially like such as anxiety. I shouldn't be anxious. I don't want to be anxious. I've had clients tell me, does this make sense? I'm anxious because I'm anxious. Or, I feel more depressed thinking about me being depressed. And it does, because we're fighting a basic life function, and we will never win that battle. We cannot stop feeling any more than we can stop breathing or peeing or sleeping. And so using the BCA holistic approach, that's all I'm saying. Emotions are hardwired, innate, and unstoppable. And so the best way to manage them isn't to say they don't exist or is to fight against the power, but is to say, I'm emotional, and that's okay. I'm depressed, and that's okay. How am I going to manage it? So moving forward, we'll talk a little bit more about how we experience our emotional powers and what that means. And then we'll start looking at how are better ways to manage it. Thank you.